Hello, ladies and gents. We're on the module A328. Block 4, How Are Empires Experienced? On page 101. Here we go. Their petition was rejected and a claim filed in court in 1971. Williams ruled out that it did have traditional use, but that did not establish a claim in common law. So terra nullius held. However, protesters opened a tent embassy in front of the federal parliament from 1972, and federal control of Northern Territory meant government could ultimately act, even if it did so after bauxite mining commenced. The Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act 1976 created Aboriginal Land Trust to acquire land and hold title, and government transferred some Crown land. So the 1970s saw the start of limited return of land to Aboriginal land trusts for management on behalf of communities, with legislation in Western Australia 1972 as well, and some other states later. Queensland was more reluctant, persistent in tight controls on Aboriginal areas, including on its Torres Straits Island. One man, Eddie Colkey Mabo, challenged this in 1980s when he demanded the right for formally inherit, based on long-standing traditions of individual land ownership. In 1992, the Australian High Court ruled in his favour. In the Mabo judgment, it ruled that traditional Aboriginal land ownership had existed before settlement by dint of laws and customs, so there was no terra nullius and at settlement. The Commonwealth Government then passed a Native Title Act 1993, giving Aboriginal people ways to claim lands. Since then, native title has been recognised over more than 30% of the continent. Though there are limits, it does not allow vetoing of mining concessions or compensation claims and indigenous interests. Claiming coexists the private property claims. Meanwhile, despite most states replacing APDs with welfare boards and in post-Second War assimilation policy, discrimination persisted. In 1965, University of Sydney students, inspired by the organisation of Aboriginal students Charles Perkins, hired a bus and took a freedom ride to challenge discrimination and poor standards of living in NSW country towns. They made a 15-day bus journey, picketing swimming pools that refused to let Aboriginal people enter and a Returned Servicemen's League that excluded Aboriginal people. In the face of the white hat abuse, spitting and violence, they ensured press coverage, which brought home to city dwellers the endemic racism, discrimination and neglect of rural NSW. The NSW Aborigines Welfare Board increased housing funding, and the ride created pressure for more action. In 1967, FACETI, Federal Council for the Advancement of the Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, finally saw the referendum it had been pressing for, to change the 1901 constitution, which had given the Commonwealth power to make laws with respect to people of any race, other than the Aboriginal race in any state. Up to this point, the Commonwealth could do little to impose better conditions for Aboriginal people in the states. Section 127 had also provided that it reckoning the members of people of the Commonwealth or of a state, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. On 27 May 1967, the highest yes vote over recorded in a federal referendum when was returned in 90 to 77%. Now Aboriginal people could be counted in the census, and the Commonwealth could legislate for all Aboriginal people. Furthermore, a Racial Discrimination Act of 1975 and a shift of the white Australian immigration policy to a more multicultural in follow, including Asians, from the 1970s 80s, gradually changed the tone of Australian society. Against this background, Aboriginal policy was moving in two vital ways. First, there was institutional progress, for instance, the forerunner to today's Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies was established in 1964 to become a centre for research, including supporting land claims in Tasmania. Meanwhile, a Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre was formed and pushed Palawa interests. Slowly, more Aboriginal people centred these and other official bodies. Second, self-management of Aboriginal affairs increased as land was bought and leased to Aboriginal land councils or native title acquired to areas. Aboriginal people acquired more control of their lives and ability to foster their cultures. Some missions and stations converted into shire councils with democratic council. None of this, of course, could fundamentally reverse the ingrained legacies of settler conquest and laws of dispossession, killings, segregation, and discrimination, particularly for remote reserves and stations. Endemic and deep differences remain in incarceration rates, deaths in custody, rates of child removals, and educational and health outcomes, despite various initiatives. What then of our future? The Ulala Statement from Heart was produced after a government-backed 2015-17 process of Aboriginal peoples consulting in regional dialogues, followed by the National Constitution Convention. The aim was to find out the Aboriginal people want in terms of recognising their voice in Parliament. We're going to read the text and briefly summarise the essence of the new First Nation request. What do they ask for in practical terms? What are the underlying things they want? We gathered at the 2017 National Constitution Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, made a statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent island and possessed it under our own laws and custom. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture, from the creation according to the common law, from the immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with the ancestors. This link is the basis of our ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexisted with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possessed the land for 60 millennia, and this sacred link disappears from the world history in merely the last 200 years. With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe the ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We're not innately criminal people. Our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them, and our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for our future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and to take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk into the world and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of the First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata. The process of conflict resolution, peacemaking, is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Marata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we are counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across the vast country. We invite you to walk with us in the movement of the Australian people for a better future. Literally, spear penetrating, a judicial process for revenge, justice, restoring the balance, and peace after insurrection. It is pitched as an opportunity to walk together and for a nation to be enriched and not improvised by combining the laws and insights of old and new Australians. On the 14th of October 2023, the Labour coalition government held a referendum on adding an advisory Aboriginal voice to Parliament, with the proposal being voted down. Though by then it had been agreed that the Aboriginal flag, which appeared in 1971, should fly the Australian flag over Parliament and over Sydney Bridge. Finally, let's recall how we begin with Aboriginal land use and the popularity by Bruce's Pascoe's Dark Emu, Pascoe 2018. There is, in some quarters, growing sympathy for the idea that the development trumpeted as a settler progress has contributed to climate deterioration, certainly in Australia, where drought and wildfires have increased, and the elements of Aboriginal knowledge, such as the art of controlled preemptive burning and attitudes to land, many have new relevance. Several factors had to combine, including a white witness present willing to break rank and the nature of the victims as not just unarmed. Elsewhere, women and children died when Aboriginal camps were attacked, but having come in alongside others working with stockmen, they were not part of a savage frontier. All this in addition to pressure from sections of settler society more removed from the frontier, including some clergy, and from London to do more to avoid Aboriginal people being killed and protect those who were peaceable, notably with a parliamentary report on Aboriginal protection in 1837 and not noted above in Aboriginal Protection Society formed in 1838. The limits are blatant. Prosecutions were extremely rare and here only possible due to overlapping factors, including the obvious position of the victims as unarmed and unassociated with any group that had raided, perhaps facilitated in part by feelings over the group killing his sexual partner, Peter. The single free settler not only escaped justice but was left to live a respectable life later on. Plus, perpetrators tried to avoid leaving evidence and enforce silence amongst themselves, and this trial may have further encouraged those tendencies. Could some choose to resist, others to come in to the fringes of settler society in a hope, protection and sustenance as land was taken from them? Others took subordinate roles in the European society, here providing pastoral service. Pastoral invasion. The rapidity of farm establishment from 1820, meaning Aboriginal groups had less of a chance to adjust and more hope of resisting. This also meant that there were fewer coming into farms and settlements, and once violence increased, those who had sometimes returned to Aboriginal groups. Terrain, the way the most desired grazing land, was both vital to Aboriginal hunting and interspersed with forest, hills and other cover. Compared with some areas, this better facilitated guerrilla warfare, sexual violence and predation, notably with sealers and convicts of remote stations, and its upscaling as European numbers exploded. It should probably add to that the convict male-female ratio was 16-1. Terror, the colonists. Experience of fear and terror, and at the interior frontier. Aboriginal choices. You can view this as foolhardiness, ignorance, or heroism in defence of the country and life by equipped only with waddies. Spears and fire, they sustained their attacks for years, clearly aiming to push back their settlers. Looking at the consolation on page 107, I am not an art historian and often fail to see the evidence for art historians' claims about how you read such a historical painting. So I'm going to use a lot of question marks, but Robinson is obviously the central figure, emanating calm as he tries to persuade an armed warrior, whilst others in the group look more tense, sceptical, or warlike. In his hand, pointing to heaven, and are there other religious echoes? Are the dogs used as symbols of trust, or is it that fanciful? The kangaroo and traditional necklace are presumably intended to symbolize place and tradition, but it is juxtaposition of kangaroo and a dog that hunts. It's symbolic also of opposites coming together, of peace. In this picture of the heroic civilizing agent are several figures, not also pointing to Robinson. Is he betrayed not only just as a central actor and sole agent, but as a white saviour figure? Though by its date, 1840, it was already obvious that the now exiled Aboriginal people were gradually dying off. Campaigning for reform. Complaints, above all, controls and so-called protection by Aboriginal protection boards, such as the many from stations and missions, did not even hold their own salaries. Girls were apprenticed out in what they felt was virtual slavery. Station residents could be turned out by managers, and segregation and neglect on stations and reserves meant some were virtually starved to death. This also contributed to disease like TB, tuberculosis, tearing through communities. The overall complaint was that the segregation and protection included limited educational opportunity kept them back. Demands, above all, to full citizen status and equality within the community for those civilised and ready for it, which did suggest a rather urban bias from the protesters and the chance for some old and unable to adjust to remain on reserves temporarily. Equality in education and rights to own land appeals. The main appeal is to fellow Aboriginal people, especially to the more unurbanised and educated, through, though they should not forget those still in primitive state as opposed to those who were civilised. That said, there are hints here of a persuasive approach to Europeans. By appealing to their conscience and logic, for instance, it reasons that Aboriginal work already underpins pastoral farms, so they are obviously capable and vital. It appeals to ideas of justice dear to liberal imperialist hearts. And there are mentions of previous meetings and appeals, above all, the purpose of the day of mourning, the symbolic reversing of the meaning. On Settler Australia's founding day, from one of the celebrations to mourning, was a powerful challenge and a warning of the potential to disrupt and dispute with white imaginaries. The Lara statement from the heart. The complex is the heart's back to this section 2 of the world of the first Australians. Here is my take on this. Yours may be slightly different. It makes a firm claim that Aboriginal ties to land through their law are immemorial and never ceded, and embody a living relationship and culture that must be nurtured and can strengthen the overall nation. It demands that the First Nations voice is enshrined in the Constitution, though it does not specify how the voice be made effective. The underlying key point is that this must help to empower them to make a real structural change in often constrained lives. It cannot be a mere advisory shop. It demands a Marakata Commission to supervise both true telling and new agreements. Unit 14, African Resistance to Imperialism. Now we're going to page 115, Introduction. In this unit is written by Chris Williams, Introduction, Section 1, Section 2, and Samuel Aylett, Section 3 onwards, who explore the different ways that resistance to colonialism manifested itself, looking at Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. Our aim is to introduce you to different forms of resistance to European colonialism and to do so as much as possible through the words of those doing the resisting. As we will see, this is often not a straightforward process. The nature of empire is such that imperialist, the term we will be using for all members of the European colonial enterprise, tend to keep the unfiltered voices of those who they governed on their archives, while preserving their own perspective. Thus, while we'll be looking at how we can study the motives for and nature of resistance, this will often be filtered to a great extent by the records of colonial governments. The initial section below will survey a wide range of types of forms of resistance. It will introduce a number of categories that we will be returning to later on in the unit as we examine these case studies in more depth. Some of these are broad concepts, for instance, religious resistance, that we can use to categorize behavior others. For instance, weapons of the weak relate to specific explanatory models. The first case study in section 2 deals with resistance to imperial invasion and expansion. Through 1896, Battle of Adowa, in which the Ethiopian forces were victorious over invading Italians. The second case study, section 3, looks like 1915 Revolt, John Chilembwe, in British Nyasaland, now Malawi, which opposed the workings of a well-established colonial state. Section 4, four grounds of concept of gender and tradition. Through the study of so-called Women's War in Nigeria in 1929, each of these case studies will help to illustrate and test the concept of general definitions you'll learn about in section 1. As we will discover several underlying themes in this unit, how we categorize resistance, how we measure the effectiveness of resistance, and how we can recover the voices of those who resisted and so explore their motives. It is not surprising that we may find instances of resistance to empires and systems that rely on hierarchy between different peoples. How many types of resistance I'm going to start surveying some of different types that we will work and under the heading of resistance. Have another look at the list to see if we can put letters representing these different categories and resistance next to 3 of the examples. Some actually can fit to more than one category: preventing empire from arriving, removing yourself from empire's power, preventing empire's power over you personally from intensifying, attempting to better your own condition with empire, trying to move imperial control from your community. Look at an example. Refusing to pay tax increase could fit into categories C and D. Lots of these resistance fall short of open rebellion. Anthropologist James C. Scott defined resistance as including things like deliberate slow working, saying an act by a member of a subordinate class that is or are intended either to mitigate or deny claims, for example, rents, taxes, prestige, made on that class by a subordinate classes, for example, landlords, large farmers, the state, or to advance its own claims, for example, work, land, charity, respect, vis-a-vis those subordinate classes. Scott also made a point that if we know people's intentions, it is much easier to classify something as residence or not. However, he leaves open the role interference also. There are no times and places when we can't directly access people's state intentions, but can infer these by analysing their behaviour. This approach will be further explored in the case studies in this unit. Resistance by states, nations and peoples. The type of resistance we're going to introduce that first combine resistance to conquest itself and resistance to the consolidation of imperial control. Resistance to initial conquest was a major feature of imperialism. Few African states or peoples peacefully submitted to European control without at least some attempt to test their power to fend this off. Some submitted when the power of European imperialists and their willingness to use the power ruthlessly against the resistance to their political control had been demonstrated on nearby peoples. African polites were generally military weak, but did not prevent them from resisting by diplomatic means. This could take the form of playing one group of colonists off against another. Moshoeshoe were first the founder of the kingdom that is now Lesotho offers an example of successful diplomatic resistance. Yay! Alright, leave that there. Do the rest tomorrow. Thank you.